Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Joel Weiss, CEO for the Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield County. Many thanks for joining us this evening as our federation and we together gather to express our commitment to and our engagement with all that is important to our Jewish and our larger community. I've learned many things during my career, and even more in my first 8 months in my position with our federation. I have learned that we have more in common with one another than not, that ritually, culturally, in our views of society, and with a shared sense of responsibility that we have for one another, are one and the same, no matter what community we are from. We share also the notion of being a caring community, of seeking justice for ourselves and for those that are in need, and that we find our own good in the good of the larger community we live and we work in. I have learned these many years that life is not a me experience, but rather a we experience, that the work our federation does together with you is about restoring, renewing, reviving, reclaiming, and redeeming all that is good, in providing the opportunity for all of us and those we serve to live a life with integrity, dignity, to be a community of truth, and be righteous in all that we do on behalf of others. Our federation does this by supporting a wealth of programs and activities, supporting agencies in and around our community to create a vibrant world and community to live in. You may not know that our federation, keeps our community safe by funding and supporting a full-time community security director who provides training, security assessments for all of our institutions, Jewish and not, and 24/7 monitoring of threats that we often see in our communities. We also bring joy to more than 1,000 children in our community by funding, in partnership with the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, the distribution of Jewish books to these more than 1,000 children, free to them through our PJ Library program. And our Dignity Grows initiative provides 150 tote bags monthly filled with menstrual hygiene products to women in need in our community, regardless of their affiliations, regardless of where they live, regardless of where they work. We also help to feed those with food insecurity with financial support for the Shoki JFS mobile food pantry here in Fairfield County, and we provide financial support to a myriad of individuals and organizations in Israel and the former Soviet Union. And we work together with other community partners, you, the Westport Library, and more, to offer a strong and united front against anti-Semitism with unique and important programs like this program tonight, and our upcoming, and you have on your seats, program at Fairfield University entitled Anti-Semitism in American Tradition. You have material, stay tuned for more, and I hope that you'll join us at that event as well. So once again, in welcoming you this evening, I thank you for all you do for our federation and for our community, and for partnering with us in helping to create a secure, safe, and wonderful place to live and work. It's also noteworthy, particularly this evening, for me to remind us all that our federation started and continues to house the first ever and only Holocaust Resource Center in Fairfield County. And as I do remind us of this wonderful event, agency, and program in our community, it is my pleasure to welcome to you and to our podium, my colleague and friend and founding director of the Holocaust Resource Center, Shelley Krieger, to talk a bit about our Resource Center and to introduce our special guests for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Joel. And I'd like to also thank the entire Federation staff, especially Stacy Camisar and the Westport Library. We are always proud to partner with you. I am honored to have been asked to start up a Holocaust Resource Center, which preserves the history and teaches the lessons of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Why do we need a Holocaust Resource Center 85 years after the Holocaust? Because sadly, the lessons of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism are fading. And as our survivors are aging or are gone, our students don't know what it is. Our Speakers Bureau provides training for survivors and their descendants to tell their stories. There are some here tonight who have worked with us. We have a robust library and film collection that we share with local schools, and we create programs like the one tonight with local partners, the Jewish Book Council, and to ensure that we continue to learn from our past. We are so grateful for the partnership with the library, which is committed to fostering critical conversations. Tonight's program is about upstanders, courageous people who step up when they see that a wrong must be righted. It's about allyship, standing with your neighbors, reaching across the aisle. Our moderator for tonight's program is Reverend Vanessa Rose. She is a role model for allyship. For the past 41 years, her church, First Church Congregational in Fairfield, has hosted and led the town of Fairfield's annual Holocaust commemoration. Vanessa is committed to the church's legacy of the service, being open and affirming, and being a place of interfaith relationship. She considers hospitality to be a spiritual practice, and under her leadership, First Church is reinvigorating its identity as the town's original meeting house, a place where the wider community gathers. Vanessa has served First Church since 2013, first as the Minister for Children and Families, and then as the Associate Pastor. She was called by the congregation to be their senior pastor in 2022, the first woman in that role in the congregation's history. Vanessa is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Boston College, and she serves on the board of Operation Hope and the town of Fairfield's Holocaust Commission. Clearly, Vanessa was the right person to moderate our conversation today with Richard Hurowitz, the author of In the Garden of the Righteous. Hurowitz's book, which was nominated for the Wingate Prize, chronicles extraordinary acts at a time when moral choices were stark. The threat immense and the passive apathy of millions predominated. Deeply researched and moving, it focuses on 10 remarkable stories of individuals who repeatedly defied the authorities and risked their lives, their livelihoods, and their families to save the persecuted. In the Garden of the Righteous is a testament to their kindness and their courage. Richard Hurowitz is a writer, an investor, and a publisher of the Octavian Report, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, the Los Angeles Times, and the Jerusalem Post, just to name a few. He's so busy writing, we were lucky to get him. Richard is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident senior fellow of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. He was a co-founder and president of the Renew Democracy Initiative, an organization dedicated to defending liberal democracy. He received his BA in history from Yale, and he serves on the governing board of the Yale University Art Gallery. He earned a JD from Columbia University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming both Reverend Vanessa Rose and Richard Hurowitz.
Well, if I may begin by saying I think your book overall is a book of gratitude. And I want to begin in that spirit with a word of gratitude for all of you here in the room. I think it's truly extraordinary that all of you have come out tonight, and I think it is truly a testament to how much you all must care about Holocaust education. I also want to begin with a word of gratitude for the many interfaith partnerships, which Shelley already alluded to some of. There is an interfaith book group, which you may not know about, that includes houses of worship from 5 different congregations. And that was started by a member at Congregation B'nai Israel, and they were so wonderful to include all of these other houses of worship. And Temple Israel of Westport also was so good to join the Interfaith Refugee Resettlement Coalition, along with 5 other congregations that have been resettling refugees here in our community from around the world together. And I just want to highlight all of these incredible relationships and partnerships that are already ongoing, and welcome you all here to this time to learn together and to learn from you, Richard. And I want to continue with a word of gratitude for you and this book. I was so deeply moved reading it. Truly an incredible work. And I want to just ask how many of you in the room have already read it. If you could offer a show of hands. Well, that's actually really helpful to know. You're going to sell a lot of books tonight.
Won't do any spoilers.
Yeah, so instead of a refresher course, it will be more like a trailer for some of you, and encouraging you to purchase it and to spend some time with it. It is a truly incredible piece of work. So let's begin.
Thank you.
With, you shared a little bit in the introduction about how it was that you were moved to write this book. Do you want to share a little bit with the group gathered here tonight about why you started the project?
Sure, and I will like to express my own gratitude as well to you, Vanessa, for being in conversation, and for the library and Federation for having me, and for everyone coming. I talk a lot about gratitude actually in the book because, and I'll answer your question in one second, but I do think that these are the rescuers in the book, and also the righteous among the nations in general are among the greatest heroes in world history. And they're also among the least well-known. And I think that, Jewish people in particular, gratitude is a fundamental Jewish value. It's also a fundamental sort of humanist value for people of goodwill. And I think that, we owe these people a debt of gratitude to tell their story and to know their story. And the title of my book, In the Garden of the Righteous, is the place at Yad Vashem, if you've ever been, where they plant a tree for every one of the righteous among the nations. And that was part of the core mission of Yad Vashem from the beginning. And when they dedicated the garden, Golda Meir, who at the time was the foreign minister, gave a speech in which she said that the righteous were like drops of love in an ocean of poison. And then she went on to say that the Jewish people owe these people a debt of gratitude, forever and always, and will always know that. And I also think that all of us owe them a debt of gratitude for giving some degree of hope and, at the worst moment in history, and sort of maintain our hope in humanity. I'm very excited to be in Connecticut. So I'm a lifelong native New Yorker, but Connecticut is very near and dear to me. I went to Yale. My kids are there. I will say about Fairfield in particular, my childhood dog was from here. And I still remember picking him up off of exit 14, and it was really, so every time I go there, I get sort of,
No happier childhood memory.
Amazing, right? And the book started in Connecticut in the following way, which is when I was in college, it was when the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington. And my family, I was studying history at the time, and my family went down to visit it. And, we actually don't have any, my family came to the United States a long time ago, so we didn't have any direct, like first-degree relatives in the Holocaust, but like a lot of Jews, we went down to see it. And I found the exhibit extraordinarily difficult, which is, I think it's designed to be that way. And as I've talked about the book with a lot of audiences, between Jewish and non-Jewish, everybody has the same experience. Everybody remembers the pile of shoes that's there from the Holocaust, from the camps. And I was sensitive, so I came out. I was very upset. And there was an exhibit at the time, which they're redesigning that museum for the first time since it opened, and they're going to make rescue more prominent. But there was a little exhibit, and I kind of gravitated toward it. And I still remember the picture. The guy on the bottom, on the sort of second guy with a pipe, right? He was around that was the age I was at the time. And these were a group of students called the White Rose. And his name is Alexander Schmorell. He was one of 6. He was a medical student. And I don't know if people know this story, but they were basically students who tried to foment uprising against Hitler. And they did it by circulating leaflets under the name of the White Rose. And they were sent to all over Germany to the different universities. They got as far as actually Vienna. And in the second leaflet, which he wrote, actually is one of the first documents we have publicizing the Holocaust. They said several 100,000 Jews had been murdered in the most bestial way. So by the way, people knew what was going on, right? And the British later parachuted these leaflets actually over Germany. And so they were, they were doing this clandestine, movement, and the core ringleaders were the brother and sister Hans and Sophie Scholl. Sophie Scholl was actually a college student. And one day, after about a year, they were at the University of Munich, and they had a bunch of the leaflets, and they got to the top of an atrium, and the bell rang for classes, and Sophie threw the leaflets up in the air, and they started coming down, and a maintenance man, and this was kind of the story of how all of these things, to the extent people got caught, people turned them in. An ardent Nazi, who was the maintenance man, saw this, locked the door, called the Gestapo. They were there within minutes, and they arrested them, and they rounded up the rest of them. There were two sets of trials, but the Scholls were caught. They were put on trial within days. Hitler sent his personal judge down. They had kind of a kangaroo court and found them guilty of treason and executed them. And during the trial, Sophie Scholl said something to the effect of, she said, everybody who is in Germany agrees with us, they're just afraid to say it. Which of course was completely not true, right? And it's interesting because now in Germany, which I think has done a better job than most other countries actually dealing with the Holocaust and sort of the guilt and all of that. But there are more schools named after the Scholls than anyone else. This is how they want to think of themselves, right? And Hitler had a secretary who wrote her memoirs, and she talked about it, seeing a memorial to Sophie Scholl, and she said, she saw that they were born at the same year. And she said, in the book, she talked about how she realized, she said, she actually had no excuse for what she did. It didn't matter how young she was, but to have sort of facilitated in whatever way the Nazis. So this story I found extraordinarily moving, heartbreaking, beautiful, poignant, and it stayed with me. I almost did my thesis at college on it, but I didn't know German, so I couldn't. But on the 75th anniversary of the execution of the White Rose, I wrote a piece for the New York Times on the op-ed page that was sort of like a history piece, and it went completely viral. People were drawing at the time. There was after that horrible shooting in Parkland, and there was the young people that were sort of activists. So there was a lot of chatter about that, but it was a lot of widely shared. It was one of the top stories of the day in the New York Times. I looked, when you write something, you look in every at least I do, like every person, what they're saying. And there was not one negative comment, not one Nazi trolling, which was amazing to me because I've written things on like gold, and you get like Nazi, like stuff. And so I found this like pretty hardening. So I started writing up these stories because, again, they're not well known. So I wrote another for the Times, I wrote for the Journal, for the LA Times, and they had a similar reaction. And I had one on the King of Morocco, who was amazing, saved the entire Jewish community, went to #2 on Reddit, which is the only thing that beat it that day was a girl taking a cardboard cutout of Danny DeVito to the prom. So you get the level of mass audience that this had, and so...
Well, and you get the level of age range, too, which is really important.
Yes, that is very important.
That gives you a clue
correct.
that this is something that's interesting to a
which
wide
is really important.
demographic.
And again, never had any... so I decided to turn it into a book. And actually, to this day, the only caveat is when Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL tweeted the book, I got a lot of it because there's like automatic bots. But other than that, I literally have not ever had any, which is, it's remarkable that I've just never had any trolling on the book because it is literally about the Holocaust.
So when you're writing, do you imagine the reader? Do you imagine whether this would be for high schoolers, educators, people who are survivors, who need the stories told, for the families of the people whose story you're telling? Like, who did you have in mind as you're writing this?
Oh, that's a really good question. Everyone, in the sense that it's meant for a general audience, so it's not meant for a Jewish audience. I think the stories are should touch all of those people in different ways, and there is sort of a pedagogical sort of thing that I believe very strongly in, but it's not a textbook. It's not for I think someone who's reading at adult level, so depending on middle school and up, it's kind of appropriate. I tried to tell really stories that I thought were really good stories as well, that were sort of colorful or cinematic in some way, and that also gave a taste of the different kinds of rescue that went on. So, there's a rescue in a circus. There's it takes place all over Europe, so you have everything from the south of France to like the hellscape in Poland. Yeah. So I really, though, did try to tell, and I tried to give a lot of the background on who these people were, what was going on at the time. And my editor, when I turned in the manuscript, she said to me, which I will never do again, and I didn't even think of it this way. She said, you did enough research for 10 books. And I was like, oh, no wonder it took so long. So I hope it's actually, it's interesting, everyone, when we talk about the book, is always talking about, and the reviews talk about the story, like the substance of the book, but it's actually when people tell me that they found it dramatic and well written is what really makes me feel the best. So,
yes, cinematic is a really good word.
Yeah. The drama of that moment in history is not. It's unbelievable.
But you can picture each of the places and the rooms and the villages and the people. You have such a great way of bringing them to life, and yet it's all historical fact. And I just want to highlight that for everybody. I feel like there must be a lot of readers in the room, and I'm sure you've seen the proliferation of books that are historical novels based on World War II. This is not that.
No.
You're really clear. You're a lawyer and a historian, and it's really important to you, I can tell, that you not embellish anything. And toward the end, you say that you didn't put anything in here unless you were able to corroborate it with multiple. Will you speak a little bit to the genre?
That as a historian, that's very important to me, and I think it's particularly important with the Holocaust because there is this horrible, kind of denial movement, which is getting worse. So, there were stories, and there's some real cranks out there. So, there's a story. In the book, there's a story about a Japanese spy named Sugihara, and he went to this Hanukkah party, and there were many different, versions of it, and the version I tell in there is that I have a feeling it was many of the other things were more embellished, but I told the only part that I could actually corroborate. The book originally had 2,000 footnotes, and then my publisher had a chat with me, and they took it down to 1,000. But I will tell you were talking about the decoration. I spoke to the daughter of there's a town. This is one of the chapters called Le Chambon in France, where this pastor and his wife, who were very famous figures in the nonviolent movement. They ended up there. He was from a wealthy family in the north of France, and she was an Italian aristocrat. They actually got engaged in New York. He was the tutor to the Rockefellers for French. But he couldn't get a job because he was nonviolent, so he ended up in Le Chemin. I interviewed his daughter. They had 4 children, and she was about 96 years old. Wow. And I asked her to read the chapter just to check. She was amazing because she said, like she complimented the detail, but she was like, let me tell you what it looked like. And so she was like, we had this tapestry here. So like all of those details came directly from her, and it was amazing. She still remembered it. So yeah, I took that was very, very important to me. But I do think in particular, look, I write fiction too, but like these stories, like you cannot improve on them. No. But and they are, again, like they're so powerful, you don't need to, right? But I do think we need to make sure that the historical record is correct. Yep. And I did not want to have, anybody, again, like it's a heightened level with anything related to this topic.
Yeah, you'd never want anyone to poke a hole in any of it, because then it seems as though the rest of it might crumble. So
and
this
people,
is
by the way,
reproach.
I learned this in the New York when I wrote with the New York Times. I was writing an article about a rescuer, and in a memoir, they said that he was a wealthy guy, and because of what he did, he lost all of his money, and they were literally burning the furniture. And the fact checker at the New York Times was driving me crazy, and he said, like, I need to see proof that the furniture was right. I said, but like it's in the memoir, and I had to track down the underlying interview like overnight from his housekeeper, which I did. And I was like, why? And I said to the editor, I was like, why did they said, well, we literally have people who all day, like they sit there and they go through the New York Times, particularly the op-ed page, looking for mistakes, and then they want to write the letter to the editor, and I just was not going to. So I lived this, and I was trained well by that.
Yeah, so this is an incredible work of history.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So you mentioned interviewing the daughter of one of the heroes. And so I'd love to leap off on that note and talk about why it was that these stories hadn't been told until the daughter of one of the heroes is in her 90s. The stories were essentially buried for one reason or other. Do you want to speak to some of why you had to do this historical work of excavating the story and bringing them to light?
Yeah, there's a few reasons. But it is amazing. This audience probably knows more than I would suspect than the average audience about. For example, I opened the book with a guy named Aristides de Souza Mendes. Just show of hands, how many people have heard of him? Okay, so he's responsible for the single largest rescue by an individual during the Holocaust. He saved, at a minimum, 10,000 people in 3 weeks in June of 1940, and almost no one has heard of him. And so here we are with a very pretty audience interest, and it's still so that's these stories are not out there. And I realized everyone knew, if you're a certain age, the story of Raoul Wallenberg, and then people know Schindler because of the movie, and maybe they know Denmark, and that's about it. And I did ask myself, why is this? And I talked to a lot of people about it, and there are a few reasons. I think, first of all, the main reason is that after the war, there was a lot of interest in why people did this. Why did the Nazis have the final solution? And why did people collaborate? Why did they go along with it? Why did they look the other way? So you had a lot of, down the road at Yale, we had the Milgram experiments, you had the Stanford prison experiments. There was a lot of interest in that, and I think that goes to a real problem with us that's innate, which is we tend to be much more interested in evil than good. And that's why the news is always, you much more often see what's bad in the world than what's good in the world, and it's just human nature. Yeah. And that did, so now rightfully, I think, to put this in perspective on this, I'm sympathetic to the following fact, which is the first generation of survivors, many of them were in camps, and they were very focused that we not distort the record. So just to put this in perspective about how rare rescue was, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem gives out a title, which most people have heard of, called The Righteous Among the Nations. And there's very, very strict criterion to receive that. You can't be Jewish, you have to have risked your life for your career, there has to be eyewitness testimony. So there have been around 27 or 28,000 people that have received that recognition, and they still give it. That sounds like a lot of people, but it's out of a representative. So the population of Europe at the time was about 500 million people. And so just to visualize this, if you were to take Madison Square Garden or kind of any basketball stadium, they usually seat about 20,000 people. If you filled it up with a representative sample, you would have one person who was the righteous among the nations. Now, as I said, I think it's too strict, and many people did, you read Holocaust survivor testimony, they say, well, this person, gave me food or let me stay in their barn when I was on the run, and that really not only saved people, it gave them the strength to keep going. We have many rescuers that we'll never know about. We have many who died. But even if you multiply by 100, you're still talking about less than 1% of people did anything. So I do think there is it is correct that Holocaust scholarship, this is a smaller part than anything else, but on the other hand, it's been completely overlooked. Yeah. And there's also the fact that most of the rescuers were very reticent to come forward. I think the number one reason was they were really exceptionally modest people. It is amazing. It is eerie when you read their testimony to the extent they would ever speak about it. They always said this, almost the same language. I didn't do anything special. I only did what a decent person would do, and they really meant it. So you have this, that I think was part of it. You had, there were more Jews murdered in Poland than anywhere else. There was also more rescued just because of the scale. But behind the Iron Curtain, you had people were punished for having helped Jews. People were recognized by Israel. Irena Sendler, who saved 2,500 children, was recognized. Her children didn't get to go to university because of this. And so there was this suspicion. First of all, there was institutional anti-Semitism in the communist bloc. There was also a suspicion that if you were a rescuer, you were probably part of the underground, and therefore you were pro-West. So it wasn't until the Berlin Wall fell that we got that whole set of stories. So, and then there's just the chaos of history. I mean, people would get a visa, they didn't know who gave it to them till 30 years later, or track the person down. So this was all lost to the record, but it's still, not to the record, but to sort of the historical consciousness. So I felt, I wanted to, do serious research to bring these stories back. I wasn't able to speak to any of the rescuers, but I did speak to a lot of their children, and I spoke to a lot of people who were rescued. But yeah, it's strange because the stories in a lot of ways are extraordinarily relevant today. And, like when you think about there have been 40 genocides since World War II, and how do we prevent that? And, one way, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but is thinking about and learning about these stories, because they're very positive. I mean, these are the people who, like, if we can make a world where it's not 1 out of 20,000, but where it's a lot more, then you can actually kind of make a difference in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I find so interesting about the way you put the book together is that in some of them, it's really about one person or a handful of people. In others, it's about an entire town working together. In one, it's an entire nation working together. So when you're thinking about moving into the future, you've given us a few different blueprints for how we can think about being individuals, communities, or even a nation that would stand together and prevent something like this from happening. Can you say a little bit about why you chose that broad diversity of
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to give a sort of a different, a cross-section of the types of rescue that went on. I did make a rule that I wanted to have people who were not Jewish and who also were on the ground. But they're all different. I mean, there's diplomats, there's spies, there's business people, there's all different kinds. I mean, I am very interested in the point you brought up about community rescue. Yeah. And when the book came out originally in hardcover, I wrote an essay on that for the Wall Street Journal, because I think in some ways those are the most important and the most relevant and hopeful lessons that we can learn, which is like, why did, the most famous example is the nation of Denmark, where 95% of the Jewish community was rescued. It's an amazing story. It basically, the Danes, there's an apocryphal story that the king of Denmark wore the Star of David. And the reason it's apocryphal is because from the day that the Nazis came, the Danes as a group basically said that, you know, they would not allow the Nazis to force the Danish Jews to wear the Star of David. Religious bigotry had been outlawed in Denmark 200 years earlier, and a lot of the Jews had been there since the Spanish Inquisition. They call them the Viking Jews. But what was interesting is, from the beginning, the Germans who were occupying Denmark knew that the Danes would not permit anyone to touch the Jews. And so when the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, the army and the navy was there, they immediately said, this is not worth it. Like, we have to, because they were under occupation. Under the entire occupation in Denmark, so German troops on the ground, the country voted, the fascist party in Denmark got less than 2% of the vote, okay? And so they were very well aware that, like, they did not want to have problems with the Danes, and they also were aware that the Jews would, like, they would not tolerate it. So even the SS recommended don't round up the Jews, and Hitler personally had to order the roundup. And then what happened was there was this sequence of events that I describe in the book where there was a Nazi attaché who was not an anti-Semite. Tipped off the Danish government. They then told the Jewish community, and the Jewish community immediately went into hiding, and then over several weeks, sort of like Dunkirk, they rowed and brought the Jews across the straits to Sweden, which was neutral. Only 500 Jews were left behind and caught. They were sent to Theresienstadt, and the Danish government called, like, basically weekly to check on them. They sent them food, they sent them medicine. How are our Jewish citizens? They insisted the Red Cross go inspect. And so 50 of them, elderly Jews, died of basically like disease, cholera in Theresienstadt, but the rest survived. So 95% of the Jews survived. Not only did they survive, they came home, their plants had been watered, their dogs had been fed, their businesses had been taken care of, and they were welcomed back, which was also very unusual, right? And the thing is, Denmark was highly unusual. It's unusual on the scale, but not unique. Take Albania. Albania is a majority Muslim country. All three monotheistic religions lived there for centuries, Jews and Christians back to the Roman Empire. FDR's ambassador, who was Jewish, got there and said, this is the only country I've seen in Europe where there is no religious bigotry. Yeah. So there were more Jews in Albania at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war. Le Chambon, the town where this woman told me about the rugs in her parents' living room. This was a Protestant. It was really a string of villages in a remote area in France. They were descendants of Huguenots. They had a tradition also of helping people on the run. To this day, they've settled people from Afghanistan there, and the pastor and his wife were non-violent people. And this was in a part of France that was literally a hotbed of resistance. You had Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, is down the road. Camus was in the next village watching this. He had a quote where he said, I think so. He had such great respect for nonviolence. He said he couldn't do it. And he was obviously a major resistance figure. Yet these people, and it was an open secret, were hiding Jews. They saved 5,000 people, 3,500 Jewish children. Not only did they save them, I interviewed some of them, they made sure that they weren't scared. Yeah. They were like if they felt like they were in summer camp. They would come inspect, and they would send them off to pick blueberries or mushrooms. So why did this happen? And I thought about a lot, and I think, there were a few things. One is, it was places like Denmark where people had this ethos, where they didn't believe in, obviously religious, bigotry, and also they viewed the Jews as their neighbors first and Jews second. The island of Zakynthos in Greece, the same story. There's 100% survival rate. But they all stood together, and I think this is the most important thing. And, it's when you think about the Danes, or you think about Le Chambon, nonviolent people, even a town of nonviolent people could stand up successfully to the Nazis. And when I say nonviolent, by the way, I don't mean to suggest the pastor actually was not afraid to risk his life. He actually volunteered to be an ambulance driver in the front, but he just didn't believe in violence, okay? But they were able to stand up successfully, right? And up to the Nazis, and because it became more, it was more trouble than it was worth. And I think that's why, like, why children, actually, this always all comes back for me to children. Like, if you can, that's why I think like the anti-bullying campaign is so important, even though people make fun of it. Because if you have a community where more than, like, the vast majority of the community is willing to take a stand together. Yep. And so it doesn't have to be like, anti-Semitism, it could just be bullying or being mean to someone. But if everybody says, those aren't the values of our community, yeah, and you have the majority of people saying that, then you really can, prevent, I think, like, bigotry and hatred from taking root. And if, God forbid we ever go back to something like this, but these are examples of places that were able to successfully do that, and it gives the lie to a lot of other places where they said there was nothing that could be done, because it happened in Denmark and it happened in Albania.
And I wonder what the tipping point is for a community to start to rise up and stand together. And if it's one person standing up at a time, as often happened in Poland, it's easy to strike that one person down, and they got such harsh punishments. But if a community rallies together, they're able to be successful.
No, that's right. I actually quoted, because I think we have to be very careful not to judge people. People always say, what would you have done, right? And so, it's one thing to risk your career. It's another thing to even risk your own life. When you start getting into, like, risking your children's life, it's really hard to judge people. But what one Dutch rescuer said is he was one of these people, and he called himself the tip of the spear. Mm-hmm. But he said the reason that they were much more successul with rescue than a lot of people in a place like Poland was that, many people in the Netherlands, for example, were quietly sympathetic. So, the biggest risk to any rescue was denunciation. So, if you were in a place like this, right, and somebody in the back there is rescuing, there's a big difference between everyone else sort of just like looking the other way and letting it happen versus like what happened with the White Rose, where people were running to turn people in. Yeah. Either because for the bigotry, also could have been personal spite. People did it for small amounts of money, right? But that culture of, like, what is the community? How do they think about it? Even if they're not willing to, be the person who's risking their life, but just like not, getting in the way or sort of quietly facilitating it, that made a huge difference. Yep.
So we've talked about some of the community work that happened. Let's turn to some of the individuals that you highlight. And I'm curious, I don't want to ask you what's your favorite chapter, because I know you don't like that question. If you could sit down for dinner with any one of the people who you highlighted in the book,
oh, wow,
who would you pick?
I've never gotten that question before.
I'm sure they're, having done a lot of the history and a lot of this work, there are a lot of unresolved questions, like people who just still remain more elusive or mysterious to you. And I'm wondering who you're still longing to get more information from.
Oh, there's so many. And also some of them had amazing experiences. Like, I go back to, I keep bringing Connecticut into this, but the story about Varian Fry, who lived here for part of his life, and his partner in the crime of saving people, as I said, was Hiram Bingham, whose father was governor of Connecticut and senator from Connecticut. They rescued, like, everyone from Hannah Arendt to Marc Chagall. It was, like, fascinating. But I think there's, people when they ask me who's your favorite, I always try not to answer, because it's like, who's your favorite child? And you're not supposed to answer that. For the record, I have 2 children, and I love them exactly equally. There's 2 figures in the book that actually, like, really, stick with me personally. Like, one is this Aristides de Souza Mendes, who I mentioned earlier, was the largest rescue, who saved, everyone from. He saved 10,000 people. Among them were Salvador Dali and the people who wrote Curious George and the Rothschilds, but a lot of poor Jews. And there's something very powerful about him. He was called the breakout star of the book by the Christian Science Monitor.
And you lead with him.
I do, but to answer your question, I think it's Gino Bartoli, honestly, and I know you love Italy also, which is an amazing story, because he's so fascinating to me, because he didn't need to do this, and he also never took credit for it, and yet he was one of the most famous people in Europe at the time. And people really pushed him to do that. I can give you 2 seconds on this story. It's an amazing story. Gino Bartoli was a cyclist in Italy, and he wasn't just a cyclist, he was the best cyclist in the world. At a time when cycling was the biggest sport in Italy. So he won the Tour de France in 1938. In 1937, he won the Giro d'Italia, which in addition to being the second most important race, is the national race in Italy. And so he was this national hero. And he was a devout Catholic. And Mussolini was obsessed with sports. And he said this, he had this quote, he said, "I want to take my country, it's a country of mandolin players, and turn them into a country of athletes and soldiers." So he was really into it, and it was very important. And so Italy had invested quite a lot in athletics, and they had won the World Cup. They had done really well in the Olympics in 1932 in Los Angeles. Primo Carnera was the heavyweight champion of the world. They all dedicated their victory to Mussolini, and when Gino Bartoli won the 1938 Tour de France, he didn't. It was like crickets. He thanked his fans. He dedicated it to Mary. Went and laid a wreath in France, in Paris, at a church, which did not endear him to the regime. But he was so famous, there was nothing they could really do at the time. But then he served when the war broke out. He was allowed to be a bicycle messenger to stay in shape. But then, the thing about Italy, right, which is kind of unknown, like not that well known, but the Italians didn't do roundups. They thought that German anti-Semitism was completely bonkers. They called it the German disease. So whereas there was discriminatory laws against Jews, particularly foreign Jews, but even Italian Jews, they never deported them. And in fact, if you look at Italy, or Europe, wherever the Italians were the occupying force, people survived. And in fact, sometimes they protected the Jews often because they just thought the Germans, this was like insane. So the problem in Italy was in 1943, as an irony, is we the Allies invaded, and we came up from the south, and Mussolini fell from power temporarily, and Italy was knocked out of the war. And the Allied forces came up, and the Germans then and sent paratroopers in, got Mussolini, he was imprisoned in a palace, and they put him back on, they created like a puppet state in the north. And then they personally came down they themselves came and occupied the north of Italy. So then that is when the situation became very dire for the Jews, and the fighting got bogged down right below Rome. So if you were south, you were safe. If you were north from Rome all the way up, you were in dire safe. And that's when you started to get roundups of Jews, and they all had to go into hiding. So Bartoli at this point did a couple of things. So one is he hid a family of Jews in his apartment in Florence, which would have been a capital offense if he was discovered. In fact, he at one point was interrogated, and he said it was the most terrifying moment of his life. He also actually had a separate place where he was hiding another Jewish guy and a Romani man, because they also were, victims of the Holocaust. And so that was one thing he did that was really, obviously amazing. But the really fascinating thing that he did is he joined something called the Assisi Underground, which was, because the Catholic Church, right, is very complicated and gets, sort of, I think rightfully is very criticized. But, people who's in position of power at any given time makes a big difference, right? And Pope Pius XI was going to denounce the Holocaust and the sort of anti-Semitism, and died. And then, his successor, he was going to do it within weeks, and then his successor came in, Pius XII, was not good. But parts of the church were great, and one of the guys who was almost pope at that conclave was the Cardinal of Florence, Cardinal della Costa. Because Bartoli was a celebrity, his priest was the Cardinal of Florence. Okay, so that was his family priest, and he recruited Bartoli into this underground where the local Catholic, the Catholic establishment had taken over actually from the Jew. There was a Jewish refugee organization that before, well, under Italian law, was getting Jews out. They would basically raise money from America. The fascists would take a commission and you could get out. They had to go underground, and the Catholic Church took this over, and they had this entire network in the north of Italy that's not well known, where they were hiding Jews and partisans in all over, including in Assisi, which is a religious town where there's probably, they don't think ever a Jew ever lived. All of a sudden they were in convents, in monasteries, actually in the cloisters. And Bartoli was a courier for them. And what he did was, you know, the tragic Dorothy Thompson, the journalist, said at the time, she said, "We live in a time when pieces of paper are the difference between life and death, visas." And so false papers were life-saving. And there was this whole operation, counterfeiters, and Bartoli would they had him put like fake papers in his bicycle and under the handlebars. And he was, if you think about it, probably not only the only person who could ride 100 miles or more a day from Florence to Geneva to Assisi to Rome. He could physically do it. He also had an excuse for doing it. So he is out there with his jersey, and he would get stopped at checkpoints, right? And it would be like, you know,
right under their noses.
And they say, "Oh, it's Bartoli," and then he would, you know, and then he would say, "Please don't touch my bike. It's perfectly calibrated," you know. And they'd be like, "Don't touch Bartoli's bike." And you know, there was another great story where he showed up at a train station, and this was a very dangerous place because when they would have to move Jews from one train to the other, and you had the Nazis patrolling and the fascists, and they coordinated this with the partisans. He showed up, and it would be like if, like, I don't know, like LeBron James walked in the back of this room, and they're all crowding him, and they're like buying him cappuccino, and they're saying, "It's Gino Bartoli," and all the fascist police coming in the background, they move the Jews safely. Yeah. So he then told nobody, he told his son, this is an amazing thing to me. So he does all of this, whatever, okay. Then after the war, he went back and won the Tour de France in 1948. It was actually a big unifying moment, brought the whole country together at a time when it was almost coming apart. He had this famous rivalry in Italy, if you talk to people about it, with this other rider named Fausto Coppi. It's sort of like a Ali Frazier kind of thing. And then he became this like famous commentator, like the way like John McEnroe commentates on tennis, and never talked about it. And there were rumors about it. And he would tell people, he told his son, you know, like, if you do something nice and you talk about it, it takes away. You're benefiting from someone else's misery. He just didn't want to talk. I saw a video of him at his 80th birthday, and they were like, because he was like, you know, he was asked about this, and also he'd saved a bunch of British soldiers, and he was like, I don't want to talk about it. And he had this really beautiful quote where he said, you know, there's some medals that you get for like winning a bicycle race, and they go into, you know, your trophy case. And he said there are other medals you get that you get in the next life, and they're pinned to your soul. Yeah. I just thought that was like, I mean, it was so beautiful. So yeah. Yeah. So that's Gino Bartoli. And I'm glad folks laughed for that part. I found it to be really funny too. If it were cinema, that you actually could tell his story in a really, you know, as a comedy. It's right under their noses that this is happening, and everybody's cheering for him and missing the fact that he's smuggling paper. Yeah, I mean, I have another story where they took place in a circus, and they literally had Jews performing under assumed names in the circus, and in the audience was the SS. Yep. Yeah. But yes, it's sort of like the movie Life is Beautiful, right? Yeah. Yeah. And of course, there are chapters that are much harder to read. I think for all of us, anything that impacts children is just absolutely heartbreaking. And we don't have a lot of time left before we're going to start taking questions, but I don't want to neglect highlighting Irena. Yeah, Irena. Yeah, that was by far the most difficult chapter to write in the book because it took place in Poland. And the hardest to read, I think, by far. Yeah. Because when we think about the Holocaust and you think about the nightmare scenarios, like visions that you have, it's almost all in Poland. It's like the 6 death camps that were there and the ghetto. And so I'll briefly tell you this. I mean, Irena Sendler, she's an amazing, amazing person. She was a young woman. She was, you know, in her late 20s when it started. And she was a social worker. Most of the rescuers in my book are not professional humanitarians. She was. Her father was a doctor who died when she was 8, and he said to her, if you see someone drowning, you must save him. And she really took this to heart. She talked about this like later in life. And she ended up, she was a social worker, and then when they rounded up all the Jews into the Warsaw Ghetto, she basically ran a clandestine network of almost all young women, actually. There were Jewish girls in the ghetto and non-Jewish girls out of the ghetto. Some of them were literally like teenagers. And she dressed like a nurse, and with some of her friends, she was able to go in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto several times a week. This was so, this was so beyond dangerous. It's not even, like, it's incredible. She actually knew the ghetto so well that if you know the story of Jan Karski, who was a Polish underground operative who was smuggled in to the ghetto and into outside of Belzec extermination camp, then told the story to Anthony Eden and to FDR and was ignored. There's an amazing interview with him that's excerpted from the movie Shoah that you can watch. It's 20 minutes. She was the person who was asked to give him the tour of the ghetto because she knew it so well, because she was in and out constantly. She got out about 2,500, anywhere from infants to toddlers to children to some teenagers, beyond heart-rending. Okay, like they couldn't get out the parents. So the underground, was this was part of a network, and they would have to go to these parents, and she talked about this later, like, people had to decide whether to give up their children. And it was horrendous. And, she also, like, there were people who didn't do it, and then she would come back the next day and they'd all be gone. She worked with, the orphanage where, the teachers went with the children and of course. And so she herself was then arrested and tortured, and was being led to her execution. And I'll ruin the story, and I'll ruin, but I will just give you a spoiler, which is that the Polish underground paid the largest bounty they ever paid. They literally, while she was being walked to be the firing squad, someone pulled her aside. And then, she, her story didn't come out for a very long time, and she was really punished by the Polish government. And it was a weird story. The way it came out was that it was sort of one of these names people knew a little bit. And for National History Day in the United States, 3 girls in Kansas did this as their project and went and interviewed her, and that literally is what made her story become really famous. And so there's some amazing interviews with her when she was in her 80s talking about this. But she kept a list with all of the names because she wanted, I think that, they gave them an assumed name, and then she wrote down the real name. And she buried the list in a jar under an apple tree because I don't know if she really thought this would happen, but the hope was that either their parents would come back and get them, or at a minimum, they would know they were Jewish and would be raised Jewish. And so they had this list, and when she actually was arrested, like they had to throw the list out the door. But it's, she's in some ways, she's just extraordinarily heroic. And again, like she was, this happened between the age of when she was like 29 and 31, and running a network of teenage girls. Yeah.
So that was the second to last story that you told, and my favorite chapter of the whole book was actually the conclusion. At each one I was thinking, oh, this is going to be the one that stays with me the most, maybe the one that haunts me the most, or maybe the one that's my favorite. But then I got to the conclusion, and I was so moved by it that I brought this book into the pulpit with me and read my congregation this passage from the end. The where do we go from here part is what makes people brave enough to be like this. And what you highlight at the end, that people who are loved put love back out into the world. Yes. When you talk about how we raise children, how we bring people up, I was so moved by this part that The innermost core of rescuers' values and beliefs is formed during their childhoods. One or more factors were almost always present: a nurturing, loving home, an altruistic or beloved caretaker who served as a role model for altruistic behavior, a tolerance for people who were different. This was interesting. A childhood disease or personal loss that tested their resilience and exposed them to special care, an upbringing that emphasized independence, competence, discipline with explanations rather than physical punishments or withdrawal of love, and caring. Rescuers were loved, their interests were encouraged, their accomplishments praised. Above all else, the most important criterion was that their families accepted people who were different. And the last line of your book, I also read to the congregation: if you take your inspiration from the rescuers and bring kindness and compassion and courage with you, you will make the world a better place, and then you too will walk in the footsteps of the righteous. And really powerful. And one of my favorite sentences was that the parable of the Good Samaritan saved the lives of Jews during the Holocaust. And I truly believe that this book will save lives into the future, because people will use this as a template and a model for how we become upstanders individually, as local communities, and prayerfully as a nation. So thank you so much for this really incredible gift.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all.
And I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Vanessa and Richard. This has definitely given us a lot to think about. If anyone has a question for Richard, we have a few minutes for questions. I will ask you to come to this microphone right here so that everyone can hear you.
Thank you. That was absolutely amazing. So I have a question for you. Is it possible to think that other than the Jews who survived the camps, the Jews who actually escaped were saved by righteous people? So I can give you an example. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. My mom grew up in Nice. My father was born in Vienna. My dad escaped from Vienna with his family after the Anschluss through Yugoslavia, ended up in Nice, on the way to Montevideo, Uruguay, and they stayed in Nice. So they were saved from Vienna because they had one of their employees who was a Nazi sympathizer but loved my grandfather, gave them Greek passports so they could escape. And then when they arrived in Nice, they were saved by the head of the police, who gave them Catholic papers from the Archdiocese of Monaco. So they were saved, and my mom was in a convent after the German invasion of the south of France, after the Italians left. So your story about the Italians was perfectly correct, because my mom spoke Italian and remember playing with the bersaglieri, the Italian soldiers, never threatened. My dad was in a public school until 1943, and his uncle was caught by the French police and sent to Auschwitz in November 1943. So clear difference between the Germans and the Italians. But isn't it possible to think that they were righteous people that saved every single Jew that essentially survived the Holocaust?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good point, and you are correct. When you, that is the, I think, when I was talking about how the first generation, many of the people in camps, you may argue, they weren't rescued, but even along the way, somebody helped them. But yeah, I think, yes, by definition, nobody could have survived without somebody helping them. And when you think about, so I think in my book, right, because in the 10 stories, there's, several hundred thousand people were saved. And if you think about the generations, I think just these stories, and there are some of them are mass rescues, there's probably 1 million people alive today. And when you think about the population of Jews in the world, that's a lot. And so, yes, I mean, without pretty much everyone who survived had someone help them. And those people, I think, by whether they got the title from Yad Vashem or not, they are righteous people. So yeah, that is a very good point. And I think when they talk about, like in Schindler's List, that quote, which is on the back of the righteous medal, he who saves one life saves the world, it is this point that somebody righteous helped many people help save both of your parents, and then you're alive today because of that is what that is, right? And so, yeah, and that's why I think we have to be very grateful to them, because it's only because of the righteous that Jews survived at all. Yeah.
Again, thank you, Richard, for bringing this story to us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out today. Copies of In the Garden of the Righteous are available for purchase and for signing after this. So thank you all again, and have a fabulous night.